Call to the client. Okay, recording in progress.
Okay, so hi everyone, welcome to tonight's session. My name is Trey Ventour and I'm a race educator based in the Midlands in the UK. So I go into schools and universities and do talks about race and Black history and that sort of thing. And I also do a lot of writing about intersectionality and neurodivergent disabilities as well. Much of my poetry work is in this area. And I recently did publish a long essay about autism within the Black community too. When I'm not doing that, I'm also an associate lecturer at Northampton University in criminology. And this session is based on my master's thesis, which I did with Leeds Beckett University, the course of race, education and decolonial thought. Here, I looked at the year 1919 after the end of the First World War. And the Armistice signing as an extension of the First World War embedded in the Black-White binary. My dissertation was in part auto-ethnography of the 2020 Black Lives Matter reinterest. So ethnography being the study of culture and auto meaning the first person perspective. So auto-ethnography uses personal experiences to analyze cultural experiences. The second part of my thesis was a historical study of Black people during the First World War, but more specifically, Black lives of the Edwardian period in the early 20th century. And then through the war, implicating 1919 in particular, during those race riots that happened afterwards in 9 port communities, and comparing those things to what I was taught at school and how Britain sees this conflict in its national identity. This session was also inspired by a conference paper I did in March, run by Dr. Mina Abdi's community interest company, MA Consultancy. It builds on that with a context to colonialism and also the war. So today, I'm going to start with a literature review on colonialism, and colonialism is a very broad subject, and this literature review is definitely incomplete. Some bits have been streamlined for simplicity. I would then go into a bit on Black soldiers and race during the First World War, and then into those 1919 race riots and my experiences of the education system. Hope to have a break after half, and lots of what I say about all these subjects has also been lifted from my thesis, so which is why some parts of this talk may sound a bit more formal and scripted than others. So let's begin. To many scholars, race was invented. However, so-called race scientists, as they called themselves in the 18th and 19th centuries, argued race was a biological thing, placing those racialized outside of whiteness as inferior to those racialized inside of whiteness. So during the days of colonial expansion and enslavement, some thinkers tried to justify white supremacy. So how we think about race in recent times is most in part due to colonialism, when colonizers told themselves they were bringing civilization to the world. Race science came into existence to justify colonialism. They created this other to justify the economic exploitation of the world, and thus racism / whiteness and ownership became intertwined. For more on this, I would recommend seeking out Cheryl Harris's journal article, Whiteness as Property, which is open access and goes into this further. Yet, as early as the 16th century, there were technological gains in shipbuilding and navigation that allowed European countries to think more widely about the world. This included lucrative economic benefits of trade routes, whereas Jean Ann Mitchell writes it was new routes rather than new lands that filled the minds of kings and commons, scholars and seamen. History books call these people explorers when we know they were really colonizers. So soon, explorers, as they called themselves, saw rather than establishing partnerships with these newfound societies, at least they were newfound to the explorers, it would be more profitable to gain dominance over them and exploit them economically. This period of history also saw the dawn of early slave trading expeditions to West Africa, where in the British context, historian Peter Fryer writes that the first Englishman to line his pockets by trafficking in black slaves was an unscrupulous adventurer called John Hawkins, who later became Sir John Hawkins. On that first English voyage in 1562-63, he acquired at least 300 inhabitants off the Guinea coast. He took them to the Caribbean island of Hispaniola, which is now modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where he sold them to the Spaniards for £10,000 of pearls, hides, sugar, and ginger. His profit was about 12%. Queen Elizabeth I is said on rather slender authority to have warned him that carrying off Africans without their consent would be detestable. However, she was quite happy to lend him for his second slave hunting voyage in 1564-65, the Jesus of Lebec, a 600-ton vessel with a complement of 300 men. So that's where I started my dissertation in the 16th century, even though the bulk of it was about the First World War and those 1919 riots. But I think in order to understand how Black people were treated at the time, you sort of need to have the underlying context to colonialism and slavery and how the white establishment essentially thought about Black people, even prior to the World Wars. David Olusoga also tells us that on one of these voyages, these seafarers encountered 5 African men in what is now the Ghanaian village of Shama, where they were brought to England as translators to assist in future negotiations between what is now known as the Gold Coast and England. Furthermore, Peter Fryer implicates Elizabeth I in early human trafficking expeditions with John Hawkins, while she also assisted early merchant adventurers in 1561 by supplying ships and provisions. And in this context, merchant adventurers, and I use that term in speech marks, really is just code for pirates. These men were pirates, and these expeditions were technically illegal at the time. As Portugal had already monopolized the trade, not only did these voyages return with inanimate commodities, but also men in the image of Black Africans, where some became pirates. With this success, the Queen saw the economic value of overseas trade, granting a patent to 8 merchants to trade exclusively with Senegambia between the Senegal and Gambia rivers for a 10-year period. These early trade missions sit on the cusp of modern British colonial exploitation, vital in showing the relationship Britain had with Africa and Africans before racist colonial ideology, at least the version of that we know, was allowed to take shape in the frameworks of British society. Yet, David Olusoga further writes, just as the first seeds of an equal trading relationship were taking root, a devastating new chapter was about to open. 7 years after the men from Sharma were brought to London, a trader called Sir John Hawkins, who we just talked about, set sail. Hakluyt tells us that once off the coast, Hawkins got into his possession 300 Negroes. Throughout one expedition, he made himself an enormous personal fortune, but more than that, he had demonstrated that the trade in human beings was just as profitable as the trade in gold. He had become a pioneer of the English slave trade that in the coming centuries would consume the lives of millions of Africans. Whilst colonialism was a political system, what is more useful in the context of race science is the ideology that underpinned it. And this is vital to how I interpreted Black contributions to the First World War and how Black people were treated in that period, and also what happened during those 1919 riots. The purpose of this ideology was to legitimize colonialism in the minds of the colonizer, but also the colonized. And for me, this is also personal, because since by being Caribbean members of the Windrush, my great-grandparents and grandparents were born into colonialism in those, as British subjects in those small islands. So it draws me to contemplate how my family were also victims of colonialism and also colonial ideology. Margaret Conn and Kavita Reddy write about this in the Stanford Encyclopedia for Philosophy, describing how early colonialism occurred in political and religious contexts. And in talking to my grandparents, I see the role Christianity played in their lives in the West Indies and the role it continued to play in Black British lives today, and how back then, as Con and Reddy state, non-believers had legitimate dominion over themselves and their property, but dominion was abrogated if they proved incapable of governing themselves according to principles that every reasonable person would recognise. Tom Nicholas further says that colonialist nations began to brand their conquering enterprises not as attempts to take control over foreign lands and indenture indigenous people for material gain, but instead as some kind of mission to civilized and civilized peoples of the world. This violent ideology of control can be seen in the work of late Georgian, especially Victorian 19th century race scientists and like thinkers that thought people outside of dominant whiteness, especially Black people, as inferior. Where one critic writes that till the European white man first saw them some 3 short centuries ago, those islands had produced mere jungle, savagery, poison reptiles and swamp malaria. Till the white European first saw them, they were as if not yet created. Their noble elements of cinnamon, sugar, coffee, pepper, black and grey, lying all asleep, waiting the white enchanter who would say to them, awake. John Stuart Mills also recognised the barbarity of colonial violence, but simultaneously believed that the guiding hand of the coloniser was needed to keep the colonised in check, who one day may earn the right to self-government. With the Spanish attempts to civilise the indigenous peoples of Paraguay, he states that the real difficulty was the improvidence of the people, their inability to think for the future, and the necessity, accordingly, of the most unremitting and minute superintendence on the part of their instructors. And in short, that he's basically saying that the Spanish needed to oversee Paraguayans in how to live and act and be in a society. It inherently centered white Europeans as progressive and civilized and all others as not. So these academic, and I use the term academic in inverted commas, underpinnings bolstered the doing of physical colonial violence. So differences were drawn upon to differentiate between the colonizer and the colonized, where what Europeans saw as cultural shortcomings, as Angela Saini writes, in other populations in the early 19th century, soon became conflated with how they looked. Also, earlier thinkers like Johann Riemenbach in 1795 claimed humanity could be dissected into racial groups: Caucasians, Mongolians, Ethiopians, Americans, and Malays, where he writes, I have taken the name of the variety from Mount Caucasus, both because of its neighborhood and its southern slope, produced the most beautiful race of men. So in these readings, which is by no means complete, we can see how race was invented, though with social ramifications for those implicated by the racism that sprouted out of it. In short, it was constructed to provide a rationale for the economic advantage of the global north at the expense of the global south, which then became intertwined. So as Walter Rodney states, it can be affirmed without reservation that the white racism which came to pervade the world was an integral part of the capitalist mode of production. Occasionally, it is mistakenly held that Europeans enslaved Africans for racist reasons. European planters and miners enslaved Africans for economic reasons, so that their labor power could be exploited. Oppression of African people on purely racial grounds accompanied, strengthened, and became indistinguishable from oppression for economic reasons. So today we are living in a colonial legacy, and this colonial racial thinking went on to underpin the British Army's policies of institutional racism, and took roots in the minds of white veterans who would rise up in violence against their Black neighbours from January 1919. Thinking about the conversations around Black Lives Matter in 2020 and 2021, race science was overlooked, I think, even though the legacy of colonial racial thinking can be seen today, especially in how we group people by race and ethnicity, from census records to UCAS forms, and even when applying for jobs. So whilst calls to decolonize the curriculums in the national debate have been frequent. My experience of this is one where many doing this work are met with silence or defensiveness. So arguing 1919 should be part of the school curriculum or the university curriculum is only part of the discussion. The other tells me the ways the First World War and its aftershocks are taught and thought about should also have sociological underpinnings. They not only look at the conflict through a racialized lens, but also consider how these events are implicated in what Bell Hooks wrote as white terror. So educators must also learn to see white people as racially marked, thus implicating educators into teaching a history as not only a question of what happened, but also how and why, and pushing questions of society as well. As John Hartigan Jr. states, whiteness asserts the obvious, but consistently overlooks the fact that whites are racially interested and motivated. Whiteness both names and critiques hegemonic beliefs and practices that designate white people as normal and racially unmarked. So there was room for multidisciplinary approaches. So history can also be sociological. Does anyone have any questions so far? No?
I was just going to say, Trey, that if anybody does want to ask any questions, if they post them in the chat, and then I can pose them to Trey.
Okay, I want to continue now. British popular media representations still depict World War I as a war for white men, including an armistice at remembrance services and films. Though films like Wonder Woman by Patty Jenkins and The King's Man, both based on comics, interrupt such genre conventions. However, the dominant narrative is when Black and brown people are mentioned in the context of the First World War, or even both World Wars, we are talked about as something extra, but not central to the story. As Sarah Ahmed says that if diversity becomes something that is added to organizations like color, then it confirms the whiteness of what is already in place. Alternatively, as a sign of the proximity of those who look different, diversity can expose the whiteness of those who are already in place. However, the realities of the situation tell us that Black and brown people contributed to the First World War. And when I was in school, I was told that an archduke was shot and then numbers of non-archdukes were sent to fight in what looked like a war dictated by the great and the good, the rich and the powerful, but it was the powerless in large numbers who were sent to fight. Amid that discourse, when the war broke, people from across the British Empire fought as well. With people from the Caribbean in particular, the British government questioned their quality to make valuable contributions to the war effort. And this was just political jargon for the British state's commitment to maintaining white supremacy. Even local British Black soldiers who were born in Britain met challenge. As Walter Toll's biographer Bill Vasili wrote, joining a Powers battalion of fellow footballers, Walter Toll also bypassed and short-circuited the numerous obstacles faced by men of dark pigmentation when trying to enlist. In 1915, debates around Black people being allowed to fight in the war was such an issue that even the reigning monarch at the time, King George V, gave his 2 cents or pennies. Eventually, a recruitment drive in the West Indies began. These debates started because it was thought of as too dangerous to have Black men fighting alongside white men. Giving Black people the right to bear arms, this interrupted white supremacy, where Black men would in fact be killing and maiming white men. This transgressed one of the ultimate taboos or violations. Revisiting colonial constructions of Black and white, where for a Black person to harm a white person was unthinkable, as we see with enslavement and the politics of dominance, where for an enslaved Black person to harm their master could result in death. For example, the slave codes from the 1660s made it legal to kill a Black person in the North American colonies should an enslaved person lose their life in an encounter with their master. In Virginia, for example, this would would not be a crime, and like enslavement, the war was a site of mutiny, but no less than from colonial soldiers. In 1918, there was a mutiny at Taranto in Italy. The British West Indies Regiment battalions in December that year mutinied against the white institution of the army. Speaking in a BBC short film, Professor Oliver Ocelli tells us that while the white soldiers were celebrating victory, the black soldiers were ordered to do laundry and clean the toilets. When the rest of the army received a pay bonus, the black soldiers did not. Outraged, they organised and mutinied. The mutiny at Taranto lasted 4 days. They refused to work, and then violence occurred. Any strike, there were always demands from both employer and employed. Think about the current strikes at universities around pay and pensions. The War Office dismissed the demands of black soldiers and implemented Marine Corps to confront the dissenters. 60 soldiers were tried for mutiny. Some were imprisoned, and one met death by firing squad. In the war to end all wars, racism featured, and this is just but one example. Black soldiers that fought during World War I were treated as second-class citizens, even in the face of warfare, where you'd think collaboration should be at the front of the agenda. Despite over 1 million black people taking part, they were also excluded from the victory parades happening in the summer of 1919. Black participation, colonial racism, and colonialism has largely been erased from national consciousness and how we in Britain think about the war. Many within the political elite had investment in the empire project, and that meant maintaining white supremacy. Racist stereotyping occurred in both the British and German camps, while stereotyping on the British side included policy making and the like to subjugate black and brown soldiers. On the German side, they used that to attack the British and French forces, allowing black soldiers to fight. The pamphlet entitled The Employment, Contrary to International Law, of Coloured Troops upon the European Theatres of War by England and France is a prime example. This document, published by the German Foreign Office, stated British and French colonial soldiers carried out horrific acts of savagery, like amputating the body parts of German prisoners of war. This is not exclusive to Germany, and similar racist thinking also happened in Britain, such as journalist Edie Morel, who later became a Labour MP, writing France was thrusting her black savages still further into the heart of Germany in response to French occupation of the Rhineland in 1920. Black soldiers fought in the war to end all wars, but did not fit the image racial theorists had for them. Does anyone have any comments or questions so far?
There's nothing in the chat at the moment, Trey.
Okay.
Do you want me to unmute everybody and see if anybody wants to?
Yeah, that'd be good, yeah.
Can I do that? Okay. I'm trying to see where I need to do that now. Right, okay. Everybody can actually unmute themselves if they need to now. We just ask that you mute yourself when Trey's talking, because obviously it can interfere with the bandwidth and things like that. I think you're okay to carry on there,
Okay,
Trey.
yes, it's very quiet tonight. As a black child, my memories of school sit juxtaposed to many of my friends and colleagues. My early memories of education are in private schools in rural Northamptonshire. Born in Newham in the East End, I grew up in Northampton, which is mostly known for its shoe industry. However, I spent most of my early years in the country. Today, still, this is where I feel most comfortable and at home. I much preferred the country and the rural to the town and the city. Nonetheless, it was quintessential Englishness, and to a degree, it was where I was, I guess, experienced a level of brainwashing, reminiscent of 20th century children's novels. My childhood was more the Railway Children than Andrea Levy or Zadie Smith, though I loved Jacqueline Wilson's Tracy Beaker as well. With that, as a child of the private education system, it was challenging to see how many of the members of the white middle classes I went to school with viewed the First World War through the gaze of both whiteness and middle classness. I know that is not exclusive to white middle class people, but it was interesting to me to look back on how many of my peers saw themselves reflected. Was myself a black child, did not see a picture of a black soldier until I was around 10 or 11 years old. And that was because my mother tasked me with a project on what to tell. For those of you who don't know, he's pictured on the right there. He was one of the first mixed race footballers in the English game, and one of the first officers of African descent in the First World War, in a time when the British Army practiced a colour bar, preventing men like him from leading white men into battle. I wasn't educated with other black children until I was around 14 or 15 years old. However, with my formative years enveloped by that very white middle classness of English country greens and pastoral fields, I believe I do have some insider knowledge of how many of the white people in that class viewed the war, embroidered in that nationalist fever of English England fit for heroes. At the start of the COVID-19 lockdowns, it was also intriguing to see how the government used war analogies to describe community responses to the pandemic. Yet I saw how this was shrouded in whiteness. The Prime Minister and co were thinking about the world wars more generally in the history of white people, the history I learned at school, but no less a history in the national memory that is incomplete. Whilst we know black people fought in the war, what happened afterwards is not really discussed in the popular media. So talking about the First World War again now. Following discussions about anti-racism in the summer of 2020, I found it challenging how the establishment stayed grounded in Windrush as the starting point of anti-black racism in this country. Whilst we do know there was hostility to Caribbean arrival in 1948, this story is incomplete. Guardian journalist Amelia Gentleman, who broke the original story, writes in her book, Windrush Betrayal. On the day that Empire Windrush reached England, 11 Labour MPs had sent a letter to Clement Attlee opposing controls on black immigration. The British people were, they wrote, blessed by the absence of a colour racial problem. The influx of coloured people domiciled is likely to impair the harmony, strength and cohesion of our people and social life and cause discord and unhappiness among all those concerned. The government should introduce legislation to control immigration in the political, social, economic and fiscal interest of our people. So there was hostility to the Caribbean arrival, and I'm not disputing that. Simply the story of anti-black racism did not start with the Windrush. Sure, this is my grandparents' generation, and we know we would not have some of the luxuries we have today if it wasn't for them. But they arrived into a Britain that was already hostile. This is something I've barely seen discussed. Though the Black Victorians and the Georgians before the Windrush all experienced racism, representations of Black people between the wars from 1919 to 1938 are manifestly absent in many of the films and TV series that get made. If we looked at the 20th century before 1948, we might find that 1919 in particular as a site of domestic white terrorism against Britain's Black communities. When we consider that Black soldiers were subject to horrific racism at the front and also by racist policy making, race, so described writing, does not come as a surprise. Pertinently, when Black and brown people were scapegoated for the lack of jobs in a Britain that experienced economic hardship in the aftermath of World War I. So considering the role of racist colonial ideology built from centuries ago, something that did not end with the abolition of enslavement. As part of the war narrative, we can see how that was a material force in how Black people were treated when they came back to Britain. Yes, seemingly enslavement ended in the 1830s, but the ideology that underpinned it still lives on to this day. And we can see it from across society, from the treatment of Black students in education to over-policing Black communities. What happened in the official history of Britain, let alone the war. Official history of Britain, let alone the war. We might see a paradigm shift in public debates about the conflict, but also how the war is thought about and taught through the education system. One of the aftershocks of the 1919 riots was a pre-Windrush example of rolling back Black residency rights in the 20s. It's as interesting to me as it is depressing that current conversations for the Nationality and Borders Bill have a precedent going back over a century. So the reality of today's hostile environment goes back 100 years because the state knew it had been tried and tested already, built off earlier or further racist colonial thinking from a time when Britain was in a flesh for cash business of colonial chattel enslavement and the underpinning ideas. As a Black child, I grew up thinking that the First World War was a conflict between white Europeans fighting each other. And it was only at 10 years old that I saw pictures of Black soldiers and then later seeing images of Sikh soldiers and other racialized minorities from the period. The role of the British, French, and German colonies was conveniently withheld from my school experience. Later, I began to join the dots between the First World War and coloniality and race. I didn't learn about colonialism at school either, so I didn't really have the thought to connect these ideas together. So there, I couldn't really understand the gravity of that conflict without having that basic context of colonialism. Nonetheless, we were told it was a conflict that was supposed to be over by Christmas 1914, but it lasted 4 years. Following that, however, there were as many as 9 seaport riots starting in January 1919 in Glasgow Harbour, but then spread across the country, including Liverpool, Hull, Cardiff, Salford, and Stepney and Poplar in the East End of London. As many of you might agree, Britain is obsessed with the world wars, particularly the second, when it comes to representation in film. It is a war for white men with other white men, and Black and brown lives appeared to be beyond the interest of popular establishment media, contributing to the obscuring of history and the national consciousness. If we were to start picking at this further, we might start asking too many uncomfortable questions, partial truths of history, and how in some cases we have been sold lies and deceit in historical memory. In a short film for the BBC, Geiger tells us that when millions of soldiers, sailors, and servicemen, airmen returned from the front lines expecting to settle into their old lives, they were met with mass unemployment. And a 1974 journal article by Roy May and Robin Cohen say how the events in Liverpool, I think it was June 1919, showed the inextricable links between the origins of racism in Britain and its involvement in the empire. The fact you can watch documentaries about World War I and not really hear race or colonialism mentioned at all is part of the problem, really reinforcing how whiteness can be described, in some cases, as the absence of race. Do we want a break? Shabnam, can you see? Or do you think it would be okay to carry on?
I think we're probably okay to carry on, Trey.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. I think so, there's
yeah. Oh, there we go.
There's a message in the chat.
Yeah, good to carry on. So
okay.
Go for it.
Okay.
I'm just going to remind everybody, Trey, that you can unmute yourself if you do have a question for Trey. You know, as he's kind of going through slide from slide.
Yeah. Geoffrey Green's book, Black Edwardians, shows a picture of Britain as home to Black people between 1901 and 1919, he writes that Edwardian Britain's population of African birth or descent was resident at the centre of the world's largest empire. Some knew no other land, and others were self-motivated migrants. There were ambitious professionals, youths anxious for education, parents concerned about the future, adults seeking tranquility, and workers seeking more money, as well as the descendants of earlier generations. At the point of 1914, Britain was still a dominant colonial power, and that wasn't long ago, a time where many of its Black residents would have been subject to anti-Blackness, both everyday racism and that from institutions. Many of the Black service people who fought for Britain and the British Empire came back to the imperial centre. That was in every meaning a hostile environment, a prologue to the events of 2014. And who could forget when former Prime Minister Theresa May sent out bans telling immigrants to go home or face arrest, or saying we can deport first and hear appeals later. So what's happening now with the Nationality and Borders Bill? And the hostile environment had like equivalents in the first half of the last century. In 1925, for example, the British government put in strategies to deport 2,000 Black residents to the Caribbean under the Coloured Alien Seamen's Order, infamous for being the first attempt by a British government to restrict the employment of Black workers. So this was the extension of the Aliens Order 1920, and then the Aliens Restrictions Act 1914 and 1919. Yet reportedly, Arab seamen from the Yemen, rather than Black seamen in general, were the prime target for this piece of legislation. So my introduction to the war was through photographs of white soldiers at the front, in my teachers' jolly old time, and none of this more complicated stuff that really problematizes the whole war narrative that's been designed around how Britain sees itself. I later found Walter Tull, and in recent times, the story of Walter Tull has become somewhat folklore, a token for white institutions to use when it comes to Black History Month campaigns, in my opinion. And I'm not exempt from this either, having written a few of those articles myself. His story is easy to latch onto for schools and other public bodies, mixed race, working class, orphaned. He ticks quite a lot of the boxes that organisations want to tick. However, I find the lack of analysis of what institutions did to him concerning, where he is used as a symbol for Black excellence narratives in how he overcame racist policymaking by a stroke of luck and talent. Historian Ray Costello writes about how high-ranking officers in the army ignored racist policies in order to promote Tull to officer. This flies in the face of army policy, where the 1914 Manual of Military Law states commissions in the special reserves for officers are given to qualified candidates who are natural born or naturalized British subjects of pure European descent. And I wasn't taught any of this in school. So there is a history of the First World War that complicates the official narratives here. Not only is this history, but then the sociology or sociological aspects appear in what institutions did to him and people like him. So the history we teach could have sociological elements. The fact white supremacy pervaded through wartime policymaking, as Emma Dabry stated, by giving Black and brown people the opportunity to fight, to kill white men. They were in the eyes of racial theorists disrupting the world order. So this is history and it's sociology. And then there's very much criminological elements there in terms of victimization as well. Oliver Ocelli further states the War Office questioned the quality and ability of West Indian men. The government were worried about damaging decades of white racial prestige. So when I bring this into schools now, Black children's faces simply light up because they tell me they are seeing history in something that's relatable to them. A history that is so frequently reflected white men in news stories that get told and the films that get made at this period. David Bulls is an education academic, and this is the first tweet in a thread about the history of education, and this was from 2020. Some of you might have seen this because it did the rounds on Twitter, it went viral. And he states that, do you want kids to learn? Here's something we've discovered. Kids learn things that matter to them, either because the knowledge and skills are cool, or because they give the kids tools to liberate themselves and their communities. Maintaining the status quo? No. So in terms of my own story, I didn't really care about World War I until I saw myself reflected. That was as a young child. Walter Tull, racialized as Black, but he also played football for Northampton Town Football Club and lived in a town in Northamptonshire called Rushden. He looked like me and lived in my area. In a video for Double Down News, author and journalist Gary Young states that riots are polarizing. They are often hypermasculine. People aren't racist for fun. They aren't even necessarily racist because they don't like Black people. He's talking generally here and is responding to the violence on the streets that occurred in America in the summer of 2020. However, I think it is applicable to what occurred in 1919 as well. Hypermasculine, but they did have racial undertones, because one of the other reasons was that white men had a sexual jealousy in the fact they did not like Black men dating and marrying white women. There was an ours, not yours mentality, but I'll come back to that point in a minute. Yet discussing the riots in Wales, activist and campaigner Yasmin Begum stated that unemployment across all working class communities and a perception of that men of colour were stealing their jobs meant that hostility ramped up. Historian Jacqueline Jenkinson also states that during the events in Glasgow, Black sailors were accosted by the Seamen's Unions. They were chased out the hiring yard for merchant marines by white sailors when they looked for jobs. They were assaulted in the streets and attacked in their accommodation and targeted for mass arrest by police called in to maintain order. Begum's article for Gaudem is a really enlightening piece of work, and I'll recommend you all go and read it. And the same with Jacqueline Jenkinson's journal article on Black sailors in Scotland and the riots in Glasgow as well. Much like the justifications for colonialism, there is an intersection here between race and economics, so good job competition. But there was a further reason for these riots, as in 1914, Black families were already living in London's East End, where some Black men had made new homes, while others, because of the lack of jobs and colour bar, found it difficult to get home. At the same time, this is intertwined with the history of unionising. If we consider the most recent UCU strikes at universities and generally workers' rights today, many people are still having a hard time, from my perspective, that's seeing that if there's no equality for Black and brown people or workers, there is no equality for anyone. In 1919, the Seamen's Unions gave a preferential treatment to white men over Black men, or white women chose Black men as life partners, and white men then showed feelings of sexual jealousy. Basically, an inferiority complex to Black men being desired more than the white men. At school, my teachers showed us photographs of white European men, predominantly British, waxing lyrical about how Britain won the war, but not how Black people fought in the war or were treated when they came back to this country. Whilst these sorts of stories are historical, I think the way we teach history can also be multidisciplinary, cutting across multiple subjects. My dissertation was historical sociology, and started to analyse the role of racial mixing in this period as well, as sexual jealousy, as it was called, from white British men in regard to white women starting families with Black men, played an important role as a catalyst to the violence of 1919. Within intimate and domestic relationships, some white women chose to have children with Black men rather than white, and this upset a racial order. And this is what occurred in the Limehouse riot trial in London's East End. A news article from the Times in 1919 states that Mr. Percival Clark, prosecutor, said that in Limehouse there was a lodging house in which over 100 coloured men resided. They came over here having been demobilized from ships in which they'd done transport duty during the war and were waiting for a vessel to take them home. Whether they undersold the white sailors or not, he, counsel, did not know. But whatever the cause, the ill feeling was very great. If there was one thing more than another that white seamen resented, it was black sailors associating with white women. So the First World War to me is as sociological or even criminological as it is historical. And the things I've so far talked about are probably intimidating to an establishment narrative that wants to maintain an official story of being apolitical about this conflict. Camion Caballero and Peter Aspinall also discuss how interracial families lived in places like Liverpool, Cardiff, and London in the early 1900s. As the Cardiff riots were triggered when a white crowd saw black men returning from an outing with their white partners. And the 1920s shaped the race discussion, where the state's efforts to deport unemployed black men was what Jacqueline Jenkinson describes as a numbers game. Biases in the news media and in the police reports were in part rectified in acquittals in the courts, but these biases, Caballero and Aspinall tell us, would go on to have a devastating impact between the wars as well. And while racial mixing has been remarked as a new thing by the British press, i.e. the whole debacle with Meghan Markle, etc., it really isn't on these shores, as it was done by the Victorians, For example, the Black Victorians, a lot of the men came here and many of them married white women. One of the greatest examples of that is Daniel Tull, who came from Barbados in 1876. And Walter Tull is one of the descendants of the Black Victorians. The Black Georgians as well. Many of the black people married white women as well, and vice versa. So black women in this country marrying white men, but also probably lesser known, the Tudors. So black Tudors marrying into whiteness too. Historians and other scholars and writers such as Imtiaz Habib, Onyeka Nubia, Miranda Kaufman, Emma DeBerry, Peter Fryer, Caroline Bressie, Camion Caballero, Jacqueline Jenkinson, Natalie Morris, Afua Hirsch, David Olusoga, Remy Adekoya, and others have long remarked on the history of interraciality in Britain. And that history goes back to at least Roman times in the 3rd century, where Britain was home to Afro-Romans of mixed race heritage. Nonetheless, the fact of white English women choosing to start families with black men threatened empire, where to cross constructed racial boundaries and thus create mixed race children was seen as a slight to one's country. So I urge you to imagine the possibilities of a multidisciplinary analysis of the First World War and the things that happened afterwards. Imagine a history curriculum that is also social scientific, disrupting the establishment narratives where these children later become subject of a racist report in Liverpool written by Muriel Fletcher in 1930. Entangled with employment and sexual jealousy, 1919 is an early example of white terror on British soil, with lots of the violence conducted by white men on black communities. The white men that accosted black sailors trying to find jobs, the white men that harassed black families in their houses, and the white men in government pioneering policies to deport black people and their families to the Caribbean, and the white men that also assaulted white women for choosing black partners as well. So while media from the time largely blames black people for riots, I think the race in Race Riots should be attributed to whiteness and the white masculines specifically. Historian James Walvin discusses how all neutral observers agreed that the black community was on the defensive, and yet its members were arrested and prosecuted for their attempts at self-defense, while all but a handful of the white aggressors went unchallenged. Today, that very much fits into the language of white privilege. The conversations we are having now about police conduct, racist policing, bias, stop and search, Section 60, etc., black people from 1919 and into the 20s experience too. This predates current erosions to human rights via the crime, policing and sentencing bill as well. There is a historical and, I guess, social scientific lineage here that exists before the Windrush. In my own experience, I'm one of the more fortunate cases where I've only been stopped and searched once by police. As a Black person, you do not forget. I was 14. The feelings of humiliation, being stopped because of the color of your skin, never go away. 1919 also shows another history of racist policing. It did not start from 1948 with the Notting Hill riots, or from the 70s and 80s with things like the Mangrove restaurant, or the Brixton uprisings, or even into the 90s with the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. But all of those things are part of a much longer thread of racism and policing in this country. World War I was a global conflict where racism not only happened on the front lines, but was a central part of policy making. Black people toiled in European theatres of war, but did not meet the colonial definitions of human being. David Lammy's documentary, The Unremembered, Britain's Forgotten War Heroes, explores this further, where many Kenyan and Tanzanian soldiers were buried in unmarked graves due to the policies of the colonial government, and that did not see Africans as human beings. This book, Bodies in Conflict, Michelle Barre's chapter is really enlightening here. She states that Major George Evans, in charge of grave registration, suggests that the erection of individual graves for an estimated 54,000 East Africans would be a waste of public money. In his own words, stating most of the natives who have died are of a semi-savage nature and do not attach any sentiment to marking the graves of their dead. Again, so this is racism during the war, First World War. It's been officially documented, so on. And she's in the documentary as well, and she talks more on this in the documentary. The colonial secretary at that time would go on to be prime minister and voted the greatest Britain by the public in 2002. His name, Winston Churchill. So when Black people came back to Britain, British by decree and birth, they were met with a hostile environment. Racist policymaking during the war took the form of a colour bar that institutionally prevented Black soldiers from leading white soldiers into battle, but we know some white officers ignored the rules. So now as we sit in the tiger's mouth of white supremacy, both oppressor and oppressed, we must understand that these varied histories are imperative to our understandings of racist violence now, and how we must teach that time period in schools and universities, furthermore in the public domain too, including at remembrance services and Armistice. So in Decolonising History, we might want to consider how it's not always about bringing new topics to an agenda, but filling gaps of what is already taught. In not doing this, it recenters the privilege of knowing who you are and your history. And not all of us are so fortunate to be able to trace our family tree so easily. Lastly, I want to end by saying that the late activist and Archbishop Desmond Tutu believed that in the liberating of oppressed people, that this also comes with liberating the oppressor as well. In education, the senior leadership teams that block avenues to progress are part of the problem, but they can also be part of the solution. When you block students from their history through dehumanizing practices, you may want to look at how dehumanization functions through knowledge. By that act of dehumanizing, it thus dehumanizes you too. It's not only that it's not only about what some are doing to the students under the institution or their care, but what some are doing to themselves. If we consider this current state of education as a symptom of white supremacy, we see how dehumanizing the other also includes treating knowledge systems and histories created by or about people from the global south or originating from the global south as beyond the interest of the public. Dehumanizing the other is central to any system of oppression. However, I do not believe you can tell the history of British racism on British soil in particular, starting in 1948 with the arrival of the Empire Windrush. the Black Edwardians and those that lived between the wars created that trail for the Windrush to follow. And then before the Black Edwardians, you had the Georgians and the Victorians who had their own experiences too. And that's vital to understanding contemporary racist violence that we're living in today, Black Lives Matter and the whole movement around George Floyd, etc., etc. So, as psychologist Ghislaine Kinwani writes that from the treatment of our ancestors to enduring race inequalities and hostility, we are deeply affected and shaped by what happened in the past, and this includes the violence and shame our forebears experienced. Thank you very much. And that's my master's dissertation in its very basic form, in its most basic form. But yeah, thank you for listening. Were there questions in the chat, Shabnam? Because I can see 7.
Yeah, there weren't any questions, but Shaheen shared a resource, another resource for everybody to have a look at. And then Vinny was just saying thank you for the whole presentation, and she just had to leave a little bit earlier. If anybody does have any questions, thank you, Trey, for that. Always enlightening and just a pleasure to listen to. But if anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead. I think we've got Stuart's got his hand up there. Thanks, Stuart.
Yeah. Hi, Trey.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah. It was interesting you brought up the topic of the exclusion of Black and brown people during wartime. Growing up in Northampton myself, I didn't realize that Black men, brown people went to war until my great uncle brought up a photograph of himself from the early I think it was 1941, when he was over here fighting. And he told me many stories of what he went through, but it just amazed me. He looked so unnatural based on what I was shown and how I interpreted everything and the limitations of the history that I was exposed to in the schooling system. So I appreciate obviously what you've brought up today, and it's enlightened me greatly, and I just wanted to extend my thanks.
Well, that's absolutely fine, Stuart. Thanks for listening. I think as well with what you're talking about with the Second World War. Mine was mainly about the first, but the second definitely, just to extend that to everyone that's listening, has many other examples of Black and brown people contributing to the war effort. And then I know in particular that many African American soldiers, for example, were marooned in Britain, and they came here in 1943. If you look, I think there's a story about Black American GIs and local white women having children together, and then there was a whole mixed race population that came out of those unions in the 1940s. And there was a book about it called Britain's Brown Babies. It's by an academic called Lucy Bland. But there were many other examples of racism happening in Britain when African Americans came here. And especially there was one in a Lancashire village. I've forgotten the name of the village, but they came into Britain to this village and were dancing with white women, and the white American GIs didn't like that, but then they couldn't really do anything because we didn't have Jim Crow laws in this country, but they still caused trouble. But there was quite a number of examples of racism during World War II, as much as there is during World War One.
Yeah, there was a lot of hostility in that. I have friends that are the kind of offspring of the so-called brown babies that were left behind because of the hostilities their grandparent faced, to a point where they'd go back home and they'd be forever searching for their grandparent, and it's not until close to their death or after their passing that they've made contact with their families back in America to confirm the connection between the two. And I once worked with a guy. He was from Bristol. He was rather sort of dark-skinned, and then I was kind of a bit curious. I just wanted to find out a little bit more about his heritage, and he kind of explained it away by saying his grandfather was a very dark man, but it's this denial that was very prevalent in terms of his description, but it's understandable because of what he confronted growing up. He didn't really want to admit to the fact that his legacy began all those years back as a result of the connection between a white woman and an American GI.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds really interesting. Did anyone else have a question? I think Mum had her hand up. I'm not sure.
I was going to say, yeah. I think April, you did have your hand up.
Was that a legacy hand or actual hand?
No, it was. Sorry. You called me Mum now. Oh dear. I was just going to ditto what Stuart had just said, actually, about not knowing that there were Black and brown people in the world wars and what that looked like active citizens that looked like us during the war, and having that appreciation now has been absolutely massive, and it has actually gained my interest in the World War because it was of no interest to me when being taught at school. But what I was going to mention, I'm recently doing some work in the Somerset and Gloucester area and Bristol area, delivering some training, and we touched on collective trauma and racial trauma, and obviously talking around racial trauma and the Colston statue and all of that, the riots in Bristol and what that looks like. And these professionals actually, they don't want to take on board what has happened in the past and the impact it has generation on generations of people of different cultural backgrounds in this country. And it was very difficult delivering this training to professionals, older professionals, and those that didn't even know what the Windrush was. And that baffled me. It baffled me because it's been in the news constantly. But again, it's kind of that acceptance, and actually we need to be understanding the true history of what has happened here and how we need to educate the children around that. So what I'm trying to say is that with this resistance that we see, that I experience and I see, how are we going to do that? Because the narrative at the moment is so embedded in history books, in the language, in the stories that are told. How do we change that? How do we change that in order to move forward? Or do you think it's something that just is?
I was going to say I'm going to step in there, Trey.
Okay.
I'm going to step in there as a previous teacher, but also as an educator of teachers. And you're absolutely right, April, that it needs to be that history needs to be taught truthfully. And when you look at the national curriculum and the aspects that are there within the national curriculum, there is actually no excuse, because if history is taught in that way, honestly, authentically, where it's about the right questions being asked. One of Trey and my MA colleagues came to do some training for my teacher trainees, and one of the questions that he was putting forward to them was around how do you decolonize the teaching of history. And one of the examples was around the empire, and rather than sort of saying, to children, okay, this is this side and this is that side, he sort of just made the suggestion, okay, what about the question, can you simultaneously be sort of proud and also appalled by the notion of empire. And I think it's taking that kind of a brave step as teachers to ask the right questions when they're teaching, so that children start asking the right questions. That's one of the that's one of the steps that we can take without even having to change the curriculum.
Yeah. So we then starting to do that maybe at teacher training level.
Yeah, absolutely.
Guiding the teachers, trainee teachers to do that. Yeah.
Exactly. And I mean, that's my role that I currently have. It's constant. It's whatever module I'm teaching.
Yes.
It's about, pushing that open and honest sort of agenda of, okay, ask the right questions, because it doesn't matter what subject you're teaching. That's the way to kind of go with it. But yes, it's got to come from teacher training.
Lovely. Yeah, thank you. It would be nice to see change. Thank you, Shabnam.
I definitely agree with that there as well. And I think with history as well, we look at it on a local level. So what is taught as history can differ from place to place too. So in Northampton, for example, the Walter Tull story is really important because he played for the local football club and he lived in a local town called Rushden, and was a part of the Northampton community for a number of years when he played football here. But then you go to somewhere like, let's say, Glasgow, for example. What a lot of people don't know is that Walter's brother was adopted by a Glaswegian family and went on to be one of I think he was Glasgow's first mixed race dentist. And that history in Glasgow, that would be a history specific to Glasgow. So I think when it comes to decolonising history, it's, I think, to pick up on the local history and the local stories too, how those local stories impact sort of the wider narratives in that regard. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah, and I remember the Lancashire connection. It's called the Battle of Bamber Bridge, and it involved African American soldiers and white American military soldiers as well, military police soldiers as well. And that's a remote village in Lancashire that has its own history that's very specific to that village, which is probably worth looking at as well. Did anyone have any further questions or comments? No.
Okay, I'm going to stop recording then.
Yeah.
And thank you for that.
That's right.